I'm a historian of medieval Christianity, and specifically a historian of 11th and 12th century monastic devotion, which means that I'm interested in what the religious experience of monks and nuns was like in the 11th and 12th century, which is a moment of great change in medieval Christianity and the history of Christianity. And the book that just came out this summer is called Emotional Monasticism, Effective Piety in the 11th Century Monastery of John of Fécamp. And it's about a single monastery in the 11th century, and I'm using that monastery as a case study to understand what's going on writ large with monastic devotion in this period. And this monastery is important because it's the first place where people are worshiping a crucified Christ who is suffering and dying on the cross instead of triumphant and triumphing over death. So if you know anything about the history of Christianity, if you've taken one of my courses, you'll know that there's a transformation in the image of the crucified Christ, one where he's victorious, he's sort of like on the cross, really upright, and that transforms into an image that is more typical of Christianity today, where Christ is sort of sinking in gravity, dying or dead on the cross, bleeding. And that transformation is an emotional transformation. To have a God who is victorious versus having a God who is suffering is something that I find to be kind of like a big question. Why does that change happen in Christianity? And so that's what my book is about, is why it happens in the monastery in the 11th and 12th centuries. And that idea is somewhat transformational because people have historically talked about this being a transformation that happens with lay people, with women, with mendicants, so friars, people like the Franciscans, the Dominicans, but no one has talked about it as something that happens for Benedictine monks, and so that's the contribution to my book. In graduate school, I knew that I was really interested in the Passion of Christ. I was interested in this transformation. I was interested in the emotional moment of the Passion. And so I was reading a whole bunch of books on texts of the Passion in the medieval period. And I came across a footnote that said the first person to deal with the suffering Christ is this guy, John of Fécamp. And I was like, that's all? You're not going to tell me any more in this book about who John of Fécamp is? And so that was the sort of beginning of this journey, where I started with a footnote and then took John of Fécamp's writings out of the library. The book that I took out of the library, the pages hadn't been cut. So I had to take a paper cutter and cut the pages because no one had read this book before. And so I read the writings of John of Fécamp and I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And it's happening in a Benedictine monastery, which is a context that people have historically said is like rote, filled with mechanized prayer, not feeling at all. And this was a highly emotive devotion that was really beautiful and really intriguing to me, that no one had talked about this as a Benedictine phenomenon. And so after that, I spent some time in France looking at all of the books that were in John of Fécamp's library. So I looked at 80 different medieval manuscripts and tried to see not only what the manuscripts themselves said, but also if anyone had written things in the margins that told me something about how monks were interpreting the texts, if there were any images in the manuscripts that told me something about how the texts were being glossed or understood. I found some really beautiful diagrams that were sort of sketching out the way that one ascends in contemplation and the practice of contemplation, and that was a really cool discovery. So after doing that archival work, after reading John's writings, I was then sort of ready to write this book. So I was lucky in that I was paying attention to the details of a footnote. It does a couple of different things. I mean, on a very basic level, it tells us something about a character in medieval history, John of Fécamp, that no one has written anything about. And that's valuable to, medievalists who want to know who this guy who's a footnote is, right? But on a larger scale, so the Middle Ages is sort of a period in history that is often contrasted with what comes after it, right? It's a period in history that's thought to be medieval or Byzantine. These are adjectives that we use to sort of denigrate something or call it antiquated or whatever. And the Middle Ages happens before this period of rebirth, the Renaissance, which is the ushering in the dawn of modernity. And one of the reasons why people think that the Renaissance is about that is because of the discovery of the individual that happens in the Renaissance. The fact that individuals are making sort of choices that are both promoting themselves as humans, right? That there's humanism in the Renaissance, but also that in their devotion, they're not working under the sort of umbrella of the institution of the church. And what the Renaissance has upheld as like the institutional Catholic medieval institution par excellence is the medieval monastery. So people writing about the Renaissance will often contrast Renaissance individual mystics with monks who are mechanized and unfeeling and just following everything that the church tells them to do. And one of the things that reclaiming emotionality for medieval monks does is it changes the way we understand the Middle Ages to be not a period where people are just sort of unfeeling and working on as part of the institution, but rather a period where people are really trying to make connections to God and their devotion, and they're really feeling it, as it were, right? They're really believing, and they're really trying to make accommodations in their devotional practices so that they feel connected to the divine and feel connected to these precepts that the church is telling them to do in their devotional practices. So what the book does is it really sort of allows for the Middle Ages to be a long period where individual emotionality is a thing, even in the Benedictine monastery, the most sort of unemotional, apparently, and unindividualized place that we could think of when we're thinking of medieval Christianity. And so the contribution of the book is really to sort of combat that sort of Renaissance ideology that the Middle Ages is a place of unfeeling automatons. Well, so coming into this job, I would have thought that my favorite class to teach would have been medieval Christianity, because this is obviously where my heart is in my research. But what's amazing about teaching in general is that you never know when a class is going to take off and what the topic is that's going to take off when you're teaching that class. So I've really consistently loved teaching History 2001, which is the introduction to the study of history, because I love watching students have all of these aha moments where they're realizing the sort of theoretical bases and methodological paradigms that undergird all of the history that they've studied. I also love teaching courses in early modern history because it allows me to really see where the roots of modern problems come from. A lot of them come from the early modern period in addition to the medieval period. But there's something about also teaching courses that are not in my area of specialty where I feel sort of free to really investigate and learn on my own. Yeah. So in the other places I've taught at sort of a fancy private high school in Manhattan, and I've taught at a fancy Ivy League institution. And the difference between teaching there and teaching here is that it's really cool, although it shouldn't be, it's really cool and was really cool in both those places to pretend to know everything. And so a lot of what I encountered when I was dealing with those students were students who were sort of jaded, students who really didn't sort of show any wonder when they were learning, and students who would say like, oh, I've read that already, and not actually sort of make any strides in their learning. One of the things that sort of surprised me and delighted me when I was here was that students at Brooklyn College really own their education, and they really want to show you when they think something is amazing or think something is ridiculous or think something is surprising. And that kind of wonder in the classroom is what makes it super rewarding to teach here, and is sort of what I would hope would combat the disease at the other places that I've encountered. Because there's nothing worse as a teacher than to sit in a room of people who are like, yeah, duh. And here we really don't get that with our students, which is awesome.